exercise before we get everybody. Oh, okay. Thought I hit a button and messed things up. Sorry about that. But I want to get everybody's synapses firing early before our speakers take over. So we're going to do a quick poll. In the next slide, I'm going to provide a link that's going to require you to click the link either with a cell phone, or if you have a tablet with a camera, there's a QR code, or you can open up another panel on your browser to log in to that. And it's just a quick poll to help our speakers kind of know what's on your mind when we start talking about boundaries. So if you could, please take your personal device and click the link, or you can go to slido.com and at the prompt, key in that number. 922634. I'll give everybody a minute to do that. I'm going to click the next page just so you can see the link and the web address is still there. But as you log in, you'll be prompted to key in a word or a short phrase that comes to mind when you think of boundaries in terms of the new hybrid work environment. All right, so somebody's been able to get in. So we got permeable, laboratory. And you can key in more than one word because I think it's a pretty complex topic, more than one word or phrase if you want to. Looks like flexible is favorite, more open, limit expectations, respect, a wall, overextended, difficult to adhere, frustrating. Underbounded, synergy strain. Yes and no. All right, we got difficult, rising in popularity. Blurred. They're still coming in, all right. Space, trust. Varies by person. All right. All right, and our speakers, I'm going to challenge you to address each one of these concerns or thoughts as we go through our presentation. Just kidding. I know you have, or we'll be addressing a lot of those, but to keep things moving, I'm going to get into kind of the meat of our topic. And as we saw from that slide, I think everybody's definition and thoughts about boundaries varies widely. I saw the wide array of thoughts and words pop up on that screen. And when I was thinking about this, I went to the dictionary and looked at Merriam-Webster, and their definition has kind of twofold: a singular definition, that something that indicates a fixed line or limit or extent. And that's kind of the image that is presented here with that figure stepping over the boundary line. Then in the plural, they talk about unofficial rules about what should and should not be done, limits that define acceptable behavior. And some examples they provide are, you should set boundaries with your children, or did he violate the boundaries of the doctor-patient relationship? So kind of connotating a fixed line or demarcation. And then I dug a little bit deeper, and I absolutely love Brene Brown, and was listening to a podcast of hers from her book Dare to Lead, and she was talking about her braving an acronym. It's just a simple acronym, but the B in braving starts with boundaries. And in that podcast, she talked about two definitions that she loves. And the first one is from Kelly Ray Roberts, who's an artist, turned counselor, turned blogger. So not your kind of typical HR or development person, but Kelly Ray's unique perspective is quite simple. She defines boundaries as her self-care. They are what's okay and what's not okay.
Some clothes.
And then digging a little bit deeper, Prentice Hemphill, who's a teacher, embodiment coach, writer, activist, and conflict facilitator. In their work, Prentice has a even more unique definition of boundaries.
Okay.
And we're getting some feedback. If you can mute your microphones, please. But Prentice Hill defines it as the distance at which I can love both you and me simultaneously. I'm going to read that again because it took me a couple times to process. Prentice describes boundaries as the distance at which I can love both you and me simultaneously. So what that told me basically is that I think people's definitions and thoughts around boundaries is evolving and differs quite dramatically based on your perspective, your situation, and your point of view. So I am so glad and so excited that we have two wonderful speakers here today to help us kind of process boundaries, especially in relation to our evolving hybrid workplace. So I am pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Martina Moore with Moore Counseling and Mediation Services, and Verna Montgomery, who's a change architect with Centric Consulting. First, Dr. Moore has been providing consulting and counseling supervision, training, and development services for over 25 years. She holds a PhD in counseling education supervision with a concentration in organizational consulting. Dr. Moore owns a behavioral health outpatient agency that specializes in offering employee assistance programs to organizations and outpatient behavioral health services to individuals and families. Dr. Moore, along with her team, provide behavioral health services to over 10,000 lives per year, and helps with mediations, conflict resolution sessions for organizations and their employees. I don't know how she does this, but in her spare time, she's also a professor at John Carroll University in clinical and mental health counseling program. And Dr. Moore is also in top leadership roles with the Ohio Counseling Association, Ohio Substance Use Disorders Professionals, the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors, and I think a past president of the Association of Humanistic Cultures. In addition to many awards Dr. Moore has received for her service, her goal is to serve others by promoting greater awareness and advocacy of understanding behavioral health disorders that impact organizations, individuals, and families. So I'm pleased to have Dr. Moore with us today. And then after Dr. Moore's done with her section, she's going to turn it over to Verna Montgomery, who's a change architect with Centric Consulting. And Verna focuses on helping organizations navigate change and improve business performance. She's an expert in organizational effectiveness interventions, including designing and developing change management and communication programs for organizations undergoing workplace transitions, such as downsizing, divestitures, mergers, acquisitions, and ERP implementations, among other things. She's helped many Fortune 100 organizations in the technology, aerospace, pharmaceutical, healthcare, financial services, transportation, as well as private and public sector educational institutions, federal and state governments, along with her 25 years of experience in human resources management. She is a guest lecturer on change leadership at the Eller School of Management at the University of Arizona. So I think we have two very qualified and competent presenters to share their thoughts with us today on boundaries. And I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Moore to get us started. So thank you all for being here.
Well, good morning and thank you, Tim. And I would like to thank HR leadership for having me be one of your speakers today. I too am glad that we're here in this virtual environment talking about boundaries today. So when I was first asked to talk about this topic, I did a little journey back about 20 months ago in my mind. And I went back to March of 2020. And the day was about March 8th, 2020 here in Ohio, when our governor, it was a Sunday, and our governor decided that it was best for us to shut down all of our practices really in person. And I remember when my husband and I looking at the television and I'm thinking, okay, can't mean what I think he means, like shut down, like nobody go anywhere, anybody do anything. And I started to think about my book for the next day and what was on my book. And the first thing I thought about was all the clients that my agency had booked. I thought about us having some people who were dealing with symptoms of depression, some people that may have suicidal thoughts. I thought about people struggling with addictions. I thought about the mediations we would have that week and helping out our organizations. I thought about all the trainings we had scheduled, and I thought, oh my God, but these people need us. How are we going to do this? Well, in true fashion, we did it. And March of 2020 caused all of us to adjust our boundaries in the workplace setting. For me, it was a huge adjustment because in the behavioral healthcare field, we are really clear with our boundaries. Things like you don't talk to a client on a television screen or on a computer screen or any other way without really having a clear setting that no one else can hear, see, or be involved. Or you didn't pick up the phone and just call your client and begin a discussion with them about how they were doing without ensuring that you had the proper channels in place to ensure their HIPAA regulations or their HIPAA rules were intact. And so we had to make a shift based on the need. And many of us still today are still shifting. And as a result, some of us have developed unhealthy boundaries in an effort to manage all the chaos of the pandemic in the workplace. I appreciate all the words that everyone threw out and that they put in when Tim asked the question. And the one that stuck out to me the most was flexible. I found myself having to be flexible, having to come out of this square box that my license and my rules have put me in and best practices have put me in, and I had to be flexible. And so we did that. Like many of you, we all had to become flexible in order to still meet the needs. If we can go to the next slide, Tim. So with that in mind, let's think about for you. What has shifted for you? I mean, if you think back 20 months ago, what shifted for you? We were talking as we started out, and I appreciate Leslie bringing the humor about us being here on the screens. Some of us are probably like me, dressed from the top down to about my waist. What shifted for you in the way that you work, in the way that you think about your work, in the way that you embrace your colleagues, your co-workers, your employees? And when all of this happened 20 months ago, what was your emotional response? Now, I'm a counselor, so I'm going to push you to think about it. Emotionally, what did you think? I'll tell you what I thought. Emotionally, my first thought was, I should say I first had a thought of panic, but then my anxiety level went to the roof. I mean, I'm one of those counselors, when a client comes in and they tell me they're dealing with anxiety, I ask them on a scale from 0 to 10, what's your anxiety level, 10 being the highest? And mine was about a 30. And I was just at such a place of anxiety. And my physical response was, I can remember my heart racing very fast. My hands began to sweat. And I was pacing, thinking, oh my God, what are we going to do? So just take a moment and think back 20 months ago. What shifted for you since then? What was your emotional response? And what was your physical response? And we're going to talk more about that. Okay, Tim, next slide. So one of the biggest issues that we found was especially in the beginning, people were dealing with grief, loneliness, anxiety, and depression. And when I say as an employee assistance professional, we thought, okay, well, we won't see anyone. So I was telling someone recently the story when they told us that everything was shutting down and we had to just do things on telehealth. I said, okay, well, we're going to need to lay some people off. So we laid off half of our staff, and the other half of the staff came in the office because we're considered essential workers. So the essential workers, we had half the staff stayed in. And the first week, our numbers were off the roof. I mean, off the charts with people calling in for sessions. We were doing sessions on the phone. We were doing them on video. We were texting. I mean, things we would have never thought before. We had people on Facebook. They were sending us messages on Facebook. I mean, you name it, on LinkedIn, however. And so what we immediately did was we laid everybody off. And then the next week I had to bring everybody back because we were getting overwhelming calls of grief, loneliness, depression, suicidal ideation, you name it. We were seeing it all. Next slide, Tim. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the stages of grief because I watched as we all went through this pandemic. And Kubler-Ross, this is very old from 1969, but it's still very well studied in research. And there are stages of grief, and they're all not basically, they're not always linear, but they include being in denial first or at some period. And I can remember for about the first week or two, I was in denial that things had shifted, things had changed. We were in a different way we were going to have to do our services. And I can clearly remember at one point getting angry. And that's so part of it. And just angry with, I can't believe we're here. I can't believe this is the situation. And so the stages of grief, a large part of it is bargaining. And that's really where we begin to get some of the work done. We begin to bargain, okay, well, and I saw us do it clearly. And the way it played out for us in our work is that we began to find different ways of doing the work, but still holding on to, oh, but it's going to go back to this other way. So this is just going to be temporary. I can remember calling a client and saying to them, okay, this session, I know you're having a lot of anxiety right now, but this session, we're going to have to do everything right here on the phone because the client couldn't even get on Zoom. And I said, but I promise you, which I should have never said, by the time we meet again, we'll be able to see each other face to face. And I remember 2 weeks later when I called that client again, she said, you promised me we'd be able to see each other face to face. And I just had to tell her I was wrong. I was in a state of denial. I was hoping that things would be back to the way that they were. And many of us dealt with some depression at that point. And I'm not saying that all of us were at a state of depression where we needed meds or we needed to really get some counseling, but maybe we did. Maybe it just took some time for it to settle in. But I remember even for me, there was some depression because I did not like having to communicate or to work with my clients or to work even with my colleagues in the way that I needed to. And I missed that human contact in a way. I mean, you think about it, for over the last 20 years, seeing clients, being able to touch them, being able to see their emotions, being able to see people who may be in the depths of distress, and then having to really rely on a sense, only one of my senses, which was really hearing them, because I couldn't see them. I couldn't watch their reactions all the time because everybody didn't have access to telehealth where I could go on Zoom, where I can go on one of the other platforms. And so there became this level of acceptance that we finally got to. And I can say most of us are really resilient people. So we got to that level of acceptance fairly quick. I would say probably for me, it took about 30 days and I was there. Like, okay, we're here now. We're just gonna have to deal with it and this is the way it is. Okay, Tim, next slide. So what happened in the beginning is, again, we had the denial, we had the fear, the shock. Some of us avoided, we had confusion. I can remember some of our EAP directors calling me, some of the HR directors calling me from some of our companies and saying, how do we support our team? I'm confused. How do we do this? And then there were some calling us with anger because they felt as though employees were making up excuses because they weren't being as involved. And I really had to help people take a step back and say, wait a minute, we're all in this cycle together. We're all in this process together. And many of us are in the same place right now. And so I began to show them this cycle and say, first of all, look at where your employees may be. They may be bargaining. They may be depressed. They may feel overwhelmed, hopeless, helpless. And so it was not until we could begin to look at this until we were able to provide the emotional support that they needed and guidance and direction that we were able to move people from one place to the other. And I need to say, probably about 70% of the people we work with move through this process in a fairly great way for what it was worth. I mean, some people may have taken a little bit longer than others, but we finally got there. But there were some people that really got stuck and were really stuck emotionally. And many people were people who already had some underlying behavioral health issues or may have already been dealing with some serious grief in some other areas. And so this did nothing but exacerbate what they already were experiencing and feeling. So I want you to think about, just for yourself, just take a moment and thinking about this cycle of the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance. If you can think about where you started and where you are today, and just take a moment and think about that. Maybe you're still in denial. And so I still hear people say, well, when it goes back to normal. Well, if you're still saying that, there's probably still some denial because we have a new world now. We have a new way of doing things. And if you're still finding yourself being one of those people that are still rubbing against the grain with some of this and feeling some frustration and irritation with all of it, you may be dealing with some anger still or bargaining. If you're struggling to kind of find some meaning in this, then you probably need to take a little bit of time and kind of talk through some of this. And any of us can deal with depression, every single one of us. It's expected through times like this that we have at least a small amount of depression because there's been some great losses here. The grief is that we've lost human contact, we've lost relationship. And for some of us, we've lost events and time and just the way life is. Or maybe you're really at a place of acceptance and you're ready to explore those new options and a new plan in place and moving on. And that's really a part of how we realign our boundaries. Okay, Tim. So for many of us at acceptance point, we realize that our lives have changed. The way we work has changed. The way we communicate has changed. And whenever this happens, there needs to be a realignment of our boundaries because we started out in one place. Now say, okay, now we've changed. Now, how do we do all this? And I'll tell you honestly, for myself, it took me a moment because I was so worried about my clients and so worried about everyone else. I found myself working hours and hours. I found myself doing more meetings, taking on additional sessions, seeing clients back to back to back when I had different boundaries before COVID and I had things aligned different. And so I had to realign my boundaries very quick because I found myself getting burned out. Next slide, Tim. So I love this research that's been recently done. And many of you have probably heard of the term or the diagnosis post-traumatic stress disorders. We hear it a lot with veterans. We hear from people who've had trauma in their lives. And more than over a year into the pandemic, and after months of political, we've had social unrest, studies have shown an increase in stress and anxiety among US adults and also adolescents. I should add that too. And there's a new term with some experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, or what is also being referred to as post-COVID stress disorder. And when I first started reading about this a couple of months ago, I started going through the check sheet and I said, oh my God, that's me, that's many of my clients. It was the first time in our lifetime that all of us were experiencing the same traumatic event at the same time. Now we've heard about it prior to us, wars, events that happened. I think the closest that we've ever come to this maybe was 9/11, but this was different because of the longevity and also because of just the way that it has polarized and changed everything within our world. Okay, Tim, next slide. So let's talk about some of the symptoms of post-COVID stress disorder. And let me say, this is normal to hold these symptoms and to hold what we may call a new diagnosis. We're expected to have something like this. So it can include things like moodiness. And I know I can find myself being very moody, difficulty with sleeping, especially in the beginning. I would wake up often. I would wake up from bad dreams. I would wake up sweating. I had problems with concentrating, problems with focusing. Many people, again, I talked about the irritability and anxiety. And I was a person that did not hold much anxiety prior to COVID. And now I sit with almost this little marginal level of anxiety. And I've really found that it's my way of also coping in this, but being aware that the anxiety, while it can be good because it can trigger us to say, okay, something's going on here we need to be aware of, but when it becomes maladaptive for us, when we can no longer function, where it stunts us, where it stops us from moving and making action, that's where there are problems that begin. But anxiety is a very normal response to all of this. See, it's funny in our world, none of us really like to have what we call a diagnosis. But I'm gonna tell you a little secret. All of us are on the spectrum somewhere with something, every single one of us. And right now with this, if we were to say, oh, I'm not dealing with any of that, or I haven't dealt with any of that, we'd be back to that Kubler-Ross stage of denial. And I say denial is don't even know I'm lying. We don't even know it. We have no clue to it. When we know that we've had these symptoms, when we know that we are dealing with this, then it helps us to be able to address it and move forward. Okay, Tim, next slide. So our brains have this response when something traumatic happens. And I'm sure you've heard this before. We go into what's either the fight, the flight, or the freeze. Because when there is something traumatic that happens, our brain activates our sympathetic nervous system, which is your body's involuntary response to danger. You see danger, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and you're either going to fight, flight, or freeze. So what does that look like? In the fight, okay, we start to figure things out. We start to come up with plans. We start to get busy. In the flight, many of us run. We're like, okay, I'm running. I'm getting as far away from this as I can. And in the freeze, some of us sit there and either for a period of time we do nothing or we're actually immobilized. For me in this situation, I began to fight. I began to think about, okay, all the people I have to serve, what do I need to do? How do I still do it? And just like I have here, there was this cascade of psychobiological events that happened. And my cognitions, my hormones boosted, my heart rate, as I described to you early, my muscles began to just tighten up and my hands began to sweat because I was at this place just like this where I was feeling like, okay, I have to do something. There's danger. How are we going to manage this? And I can remember weeks later having some tension. I was having tension up here in my body. And we have on staff a yoga therapist. And I remember calling her and saying, we need some virtual yoga. I can feel it. I need some way of relieving some of this tension. And I know if I'm feeling like this constantly, then others are feeling this way. So we began to do yoga every single day on Zoom with all of our companies, with all of our employees, because all of us were either at just fight, flight, or freeze. And we needed to get our bodies at a place where we could relax, where we could center ourselves, and we can begin to think clearly. But this is a normal response to stress and when we feel as though we are in danger. Okay, Tim, next slide. So I want to talk to you about some tips on how to self-regulate yourself through all of this, because I've talked to you about we all are dealing with some level of this grief. We all are probably at a place where we are experiencing some symptoms of post-COVID stress disorder. And then many of us have had some response in our bodies or our minds due to this stressful event. So how do we self-regulate? Well, one of the things that I started doing through this even the more was breathing. And I know, okay, we have to breathe to live, but mindfully breathing and consciously breathing. Every day, I set a little timer on my phone. About 3 times throughout my day, it goes off, and I stop when that happens. And I have a 3-minute timer to stop and mindfully breathe. It does wonders. Exercising, many of you know this. Body movement, getting up. I mean, we're sitting. Right now, we're going to be sitting here for the next, we've already been here for 30, 40 minutes. We're going to be here for a little while longer. We talked about putting on the weight and sitting here and not exercising as much. And also being aware of our body sensations. One of the things I have to do now is sit with a pillow on my back because I'm sitting in Zoom so much and my back began to ache and my body began to ache because I was so used to being up walking around. I did a lot of presentations and workshops and I'm a walker. Well, now everything was sitting here. Attending for a care for your body, your nutrition. We talked about the food piece, and then meditation and prayer. And I don't know who you pray to or who you meditate to or what you do, but the research just shows that some form of meditation and prayer does help to center us and to get us at a place where we're relaxed and throughout our day. And being involved in art and music and dance and writing, and then nurturing self-talk. One of the things I started doing right before COVID is I sent out these Dr. Moore Monday moments. And they're just a way of self-positive talk for ourselves, something to focus on each day or each week. And especially during the times like this that we've been through. What we don't often do is give ourselves the care that we need. And so it's important to be gentle and kind to yourself. And ways of doing that, and as a counselor, I'm going to tell you it's okay to talk to yourself. Yeah, it's okay. No one's going to talk back to you, I promise. It's okay to talk to yourself. Give yourself some attaboys or attagirls. Give yourself some positive feedback. It really does feel good. Okay, Tim, next slide. We talked about mindfulness, and many psychologists suggest that practicing it helps to improve your self-regulation. And then I was just talking about cognitive reframing. Involves challenging your thoughts. During this time, it was so difficult for many people to find anything positive. I mean, I would hear people from, I can't get toilet paper. They're running out of water at the grocery store. I'm afraid to go to the grocery store. I mean, and so we really had to reframe things. And so I found myself finding ways of helping people rethinking and reframing our thoughts. It is true. What comes out of your mouth affects your heart, your mind, and your outcome. When our mouth and our words begin to change, then our outcome begins to change. It really does boost you in ways that you never thought of. Next slide. So emotional literacy is your ability to identify and understand your emotions. And so I don't know if you guys ever seen it. I wish I would have put it on here. In counseling, we have something that's called the feelings chart. You can go, you can find it, you can Google it online. And it shows you different feelings and emotions. And just being able to identify, this is my emotion today. So I do a self-check-in in the morning. I'm a part of a little group. And we do a 15-minute check-in with each other. And we always start with, what are you feeling or what's your emotion for that day? Sometimes I'm feeling anxious. Sometimes I'm feeling excited. Sometimes I'm feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes I'm feeling a little depressed. You name it, but naming what your emotions is. Let me give you a little secret. If you know your emotion, you know how to be in charge of it. When we can't name it and we don't know what it is, we can't be in charge of it, so it controls us. So it's important to be able to name what it is and identify it. And with that, it helps you to identify your stressors and your triggers. We all have triggers. We all have stressors. And especially now, But when you know what your trigger is, when you know these are things that exacerbates my negative emotions and even my positive emotions. And then what we call deliberate thinking, staying calm and thinking rationally before you react. Many of us in this time had to respond because we weren't prepared for this. So we had to react. We had to be on the defense. And some of us are still on the defense. So it's time to come off of the defense and get on the offense. And when you have a great offensive team, like my Browns, I don't care what anybody says, when you have a great offensive team, the plays are wonderful because they've already thought about how are we going to do this? How are we going to get that ball over to score that touchdown? And so for us, when we do deliberate thinking, it helps us to be on the offense and really think about what's next for us. Next slide, Tim. So just a few more things, a few more tips I want to give you, and just setting clear times when you're setting your boundaries in the workplace of signing on and off. I told you in the beginning, I was on, and it's so easy on Zoom. I remember looking, it was about in November or December, I looked and I started adding up how many hours I spent a day working. And literally one day I was off and on maybe about 16 hours from getting on this Zoom call, getting on that call, getting on this phone call. We have to set clear times. It's time to restructure our boundaries again. When online for work, have your video feature on. This is when I'm on. And then when I'm off, turn it off and be off. Dress for the workplace. We laugh about the top up, but really prepare yourself. Comb your hair, brush your teeth, and set your workspace at home as an office space. I had to really work on this. I remember in the beginning, the first day or two, I was sitting on my couch. I think this is not going to work because if I keep sitting on this couch, I'm going to act like I'm sitting on my couch. So I had to get into a space that was good for me. And remember, there are still workplace policies. And it's good to remind your employees of this, such as professionalism. I mean, I remember people getting on and there was just so many elements of unprofessionalism, things we would not have done if we were in the workplace. Now, I do, recognize we're in people's homes, but now we've set up this hybrid model. And as I had to tell an employee just recently, okay, that means from 8 o'clock to 4:30, you're on work time. And so your workstation needs to look like that. You need to look like that. And your background needs to look like that. All right, next slide. So how can you support your team? Well, encourage them to set healthy boundaries. Don't encourage them to work 10, 12, 13, 14 hours a day. Respect their appropriate boundaries. When they have appropriate boundaries, respect them. And for you, you should also model healthy workplace boundaries. If you did it before COVID, you should add it. If you didn't, it's time to start doing it. And have discussions frequently about the hybrid way of working. What is it going to look like? What does it look like? How are you managing this? Are you struggling with it? And highlight their successes in this new work environment. If they're doing well, if they've adjusted well, if they've been able to still meet productivity or whatever they're required to do, you want to talk to them about that and attempt to find ways to create community. So one of the things we do is we give enough time for people to get on a little earlier to check in with each other, see how things are going, and then we leave it open for people to get on later. And so you just want to still create community pre and post meetings. Next slide. So I want to now turn it over to Verna, who's going to take it from here. Verna?
My button didn't work. I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Dr. Moore. I'm very pleased to know that the conversations that I have out loud with myself all day long as I work from home are healthy behaviors, because I was getting a little worried. So if nothing else, I walk away from this with knowing that I have some healthy behaviors in my workplace. So A lot of what Dr. Moore talked about today, I'm going to reinforce with some best practices that I'm seeing employers helping their employees with, as well as some best practices that employees are sharing with each other around how they're setting boundaries, how they're avoiding isolation, and how they're managing and balancing their work-life balance. So I think there's some synergy between what Dr. Moore presented and what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. You know, Centric, as you probably know, has been working as a hybrid model for its entire existence for 20 years. And so a lot of what we've learned, we're helping to share with clients across the United States and globally as well. And there's a lot to be learned in how this works and how you set up boundaries and how you put programs in place that empower people. You know, while autonomy and flexibility are empowering for many people, the isolation that we're seeing people feel is real. And the need to build skills in effectively managing your work-life balance is top of mind for almost everyone that we work with in the workforce. Every day, this is what I live. I work with organizations. I do focus groups. I do, you know, leadership interviews in the C-suite and below. And I would say there's a couple of things that, you know, emerge in every conversation. It's around, how do I help my people set boundaries? How do I help them achieve better work-life balance? I'm nervous about the isolation that a lot of my people are feeling. So I'm going to share with you some of the tips and tricks that we're finding from companies across the United States. Next slide. As you know, there's a lot of discussion in the media right now, you know, and in the C-suites around, you know, multiple industries are thinking about what is the right model for the future of work. A lot of consternation about that. In fact, this past Sunday in the New York Times, the business section dedicated a fair amount of real estate to talking to CEOs about the need to go back to the office without alienating those who want to work remotely. And so there's a real tension right now around, what do employees want, what is best for the business, and how do we balance that so that we can attract and retain the right talent over time. Next slide. What we're seeing at Centric is hybrid is already won. That is the new normal, but how hybrid is being built differs significantly from organization to organization. I think in all of the work that I've done with organizations, there's no two identical definitions of what hybrid means. And so that creates a little bit of confusion for folks. And, you know, but I think people were feeling that we are moving into a new normal. People were waiting for it to get back to the old normal, as Dr. Moore mentioned. But I think people now are truly embracing the fact that work is never going to be the same moving forward. Next slide. So, and what's incumbent in this whole hybrid model is this increasing recognition that the workplace is not just a place where you apply your skills and your knowledge and you create value, but it's an important social space where you connect with other human beings. And as I've talked with employees, and I've talked with thousands of them through focus groups, it's clear that one of the top concerns they have is losing connection. Always having to be available and not being able to shut down from work mode. But another thing that I think we lose sight of is that people are very fearful about not being seen working. If you don't see me working long and hard, do I become invisible and do I become irrelevant? And so all of that is causing a lot of tension in the workplace around I have to be available 24/7. I have to respond immediately when I get an email or a text because people won't think I'm working. And that creates a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety for folks, and a lot of fear that people will burn out and leave. Next slide. So as I said, this new hybrid working paradigm should enable people to effectively work where they are, and encourage autonomy and community, and establish new virtual rituals and cultural norms. And it has to be intentional. I think what's happened since COVID started in 2020 was that nothing was deliberate and intentional. It just sort of evolved by necessity. And now we're seeing there's more intentionality and deliberate decision-making around how we empower and support our workforce and what can we do in terms of investment in our people. Next slide. I've done a lot of work with leaders, and there's a lot of things that are top of mind to them right now. You know, a lot of it is about workers are leaving the job. They're, you know, the great resignation, I think they're calling it in the media these days. The fight for quality talent is really fierce. So those who really focus on understanding their workforce, their needs, and can provide some innovative approaches to helping their employees thrive are the ones that are retaining and building and growing their workforce. I won't walk through all of these in terms of time here, but there's two that I think, as I looked through all of my notes and data from leadership interviews, there's two things that come out in the first or second points that leaders make when we sit down and we talk to them. The first one is the need to reinforce engagement and connectedness. And they want to understand what are those signs of when that is deteriorating? What does that look like? And then putting programs and activities in place that are sustainable. Not these one-off events that make people feel good, but what is sort of that sustainable program that connects people over the long term? So that's number one. Number two that I hear, you know, time and time again from leaders is how do we help mitigate stress and the work-life imbalance that most of our people are feeling? And how do we do that through skills development and coaching, so that people can build those better boundaries? We need to do it for ourselves first, but we also need to figure out what is the best way to support our people, and really with a focus of overall wellness is what I'm hearing. So those are the two top of mind things among all of these that you'll see on this slide. Next slide. You know, there's benefits of doing this well, but I want to focus on the risks because I've seen a lot of organizations not think through all of the pieces of putting this hybrid workplace in place, and have it be sustainable. And we see these poorly executed, you know, attributes in all industries. Small businesses, large businesses in large urban areas, as well as suburban. You've got disconnection leads to isolation. Isolation leads to a lack of productivity. A lack of boundaries leads to burnout and a lack of overall well-being. And ultimately what we're seeing is it leads to increased turnover and eroding product quality and service quality for companies. So getting at the very beginning of what is it that our people need and how are we empowering them and giving them the tools.
Can't get to me at all. It's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free.
Next slide. So it comes down to a few fundamental things. There's a lot that goes into a hybrid workplace that works, but give employees the flexibility and the tools to manage their own work-life experience, to be able to work where they want and when they are most productive. We all have, a time in the day when we're most productive. So let's think about that when we're building a plan at the individual level. And then help people establish boundaries that allow them to minimize burnout while staying connected and engaged, and be intentional about it. So I want to share some, next slide, please. Next slide. I've always loved this quote from Dolly Parton. And since the pandemic began, workers are making more conscious choices about what is important to them. And I think what I'm seeing from leaders in organizations is that they are recognizing that we're all individuals, and we make different choices about that desirable balance of all of the forces in our life. Next slide. So forward-thinking organizations are helping their employees think about what I call life dimensions that are important to them. And I've seen a lot of companies do lunch and learns and provide training in this area as well. How do you balance your spiritual and physical and emotional and work and family and philanthropy and financial health? And what does that look like? And what are the boundaries around all of those for people? Everybody has priorities in those dimensions. We're also seeing a lot of companies providing coaching for people on tactics that will make them more productive when working remotely. So, how do you set a calendar? How do you stay focused and energetic around the things that are important to you? How do you leverage all of the available tools? What I'm finding more and more is that, leaders are saying we've got lots of tools for people to be able to manage their work and their life. They just need to use them. A, people don't know about all the tools, and B, people don't know how to use them to their maximum efficiency. So a lot of training and coaching around, using the tools that are available to you to make the most of your workday. And they're helping, a lot of companies are helping people establish routines and schedules that allow them to turn off at the end of the day. We're seeing more and more companies do things like, do not send emails out after 6 o'clock at night or before 8 o'clock in the morning. They will not get answered. Those kinds of things that allow you to shut down as sort of corporate policies. Next slide, please. So there's some short-term implications and some medium and long-term implications. Always being on, staying tethered to your devices 24/7 is very anxiety producing for folks. Not taking daily lunch breaks or coffee breaks or exercise breaks, not having that commute time anymore as a buffer to the beginning of your day and the end of your day that help you de-stress before you move into the next phase of your day. Those are some of the short-term, challenges. And in the long term, without balance and boundaries, you have a difficult time. You're sacrificing your life goals for more time at work. That's what we're seeing people tell us time and time again, is that, I am making choices right now because I want to stay productive. I want to be I don't want to be invisible. So I'm spending more and more time doing my work and less time on the other parts of my life that are important to me. And then there's that overall feeling of you're not meeting anyone's expectations. I'm not meeting my family's expectations. I'm not meeting my boss's expectations. I'm not meeting my own expectations. So those longer term goals have mental and emotional health, implications over the long term. Next slide. So to prepare for today's discussion, I went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of focus group data. And, you know, people tell us what's important. And so, you know, these are consistently reported the goodness of being in a hybrid environment. You know, it's about the flexibility as, you know, people are able to, you know, have their day be their own. Some people feel that there's been more intentionality around connecting and communicating since they've been working remotely, because you don't have those, you know, drive-by conversations or in, you know, in the lunchroom or at the elevator bay or, you know, popping your head over somebody's cubicle, etc. That people are going out of their way to be more transparent and communicative and let people know what's going on in the organization. They've had to be more deliberate about that. So there's lots of goodness, but the other side of the coin, next slide, please, is that there's real challenges for many. And I'll tell you, having done a lot of these focus groups over the last, you know, 6 to 8 months, the stories will break your heart, really, in terms of people feeling isolated, feeling disconnected, feeling stressed. You know, lots of feedback around, you know, I can't be on camera anymore. I've got video fatigue. We don't run virtual meetings in a way that is productive, and I don't know how to, you know, raise my hand and you know, contribute during a virtual meeting. And, you know, one of the things that I find really interesting is that we tend to think that people working remotely are in a single family home where they are, you know, there's other people in the household and so forth. And what I've learned is that about 40% of the workforce in urban areas are single occupancy. They live alone. And so that feeling of, I don't connect with people, I just want to be around other human beings, it's not the same over video, can be really tragic for people who live alone. You know, I've talked to a lot of people that live in the New York area, and, you know, an efficiency apartment in Manhattan, you know, by yourself can be, you know, really isolating and depressing for folks. So we're seeing that people are working much longer days. They have an inability to shut down. Fear of being viewed is not working if they can't respond immediately to a text or email. So they carry their devices into the bathroom. I mean, those are the kinds of things that people are sharing. You know, there's a lot of concern about connectivity, sense of community, and engagement. Next slide. So here's some suggestions of what I see best-in-class organizations doing, is helping people assess their life balance, and, you know, looking at these 8 dimensions and helping people develop for themselves where those gaps are. What do I need to start doing, stop doing, continue doing, do more of, do less of? And, you know, through structured exercises, I sat through one of these lunch and learns with one company, and it was, you know, a very engaging conversation where people had aha moments left and right around how they were spending their time and the delta between what they value and where they're really spending their time and energy. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of foundational you know, thought process and allowing people to have the tools to be able to think that through for themselves. Next slide. You know, companies are also reinforcing, you know, healthy boundaries. And these are the things that companies are doing in a proactive, deliberate way. You know, they're helping, you know, setting sort of agreements with their employees around what are the realistic limits of what you will and will not do at home and at work. And clearly communicating these boundaries to everyone so that it's almost a service level agreement without, you know, using that term. of, here's my limits, here's what I can do, and here's what I can't do. I have childcare responsibilities. I need to drop my child off at school in the morning. I'm going to log off at 6 o'clock every night because that's dinner time and family time. And having that be more deliberate and communicated so that nobody has to guess. Ruthlessly scheduling and tracking your time. People don't realize how they spend their time. And we've had several organizations do an exercise where for 60 days, you write down every hour that you spend in a meeting versus on video versus heads down doing, productive deliverables and so forth. And there was a lot of aha moments around how you're spending your time and the amount of time that's being spent in meetings and so forth. So, and ruthlessly scheduling your time, blocking things on your calendar so that you have quiet time to be able to do things. Setting a routine. I have high energy times that I'm more productive. I'm not a late night person. My productivity is between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. And I have some non-negotiables. There are things that, I have an allergy shot every Friday at noon. So you're not going to get me on Fridays at noon. So those non-negotiables are really important, and they need to be supported by the organization. I think Dr. Moore talked about this, scheduling renewal time into your day. It could be as easy as stepping away from your desk and walking around the block, or going out to the patio and watering your plants or what have you. We're finding that people are spending way too much time tethered to their desk because everything is a Teams call or a Zoom call. People don't use the phone anymore, so you can't really be mobile as much as you used to be able to be. Leave work at work, having that mental on and off switch. And sometimes that means having a dedicated space where I do work in my workspace and I do my life in my life space. And knowing that you're going to turn off at a certain point or turn on at a certain point, and be consistent with that on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Moore talked about this as well, taking care of your health, making sure that that doesn't take, a second seat, because if you're unhealthy in terms of your eating, your sleeping, your hydration, etc., it affects, how you relate to your work. Nurturing those family and social relationships. I mean, we talk a lot about, the sense of community that you have at work, but it shouldn't be a substitute for the sense of community that you have in your broader life circle. So nurturing those family and social relationships. We're finding more and more that there's a lot of resources available for people that are offered through their companies, but they are not aware of them, and they don't know how to access them, and they're afraid to access them because they will appear to be needy. And so demystifying all of those resources, making sure that people feel that it's okay to avail themselves of what those resources are, is important. Asking your manager for help and making that, a safe space for folks to be able to do that. We're seeing a lot of companies, training their managers that have direct reports on how to provide help without being too intrusive. And being able to, spot the signs of people who may be struggling, etc. And then working smarter, not harder, or longer. And you've got a lot of people, I wish I had a nickel for every time in a focus group somebody says to me, nobody's going to see how long I work. I used to come in before my boss and I used to leave after my boss. And I always on my performance reviews would hear, you're a hard worker. And so I think reframing what work is and what productivity is, and having it be results oriented, not hours logged. We're seeing a lot of companies moving to a different performance management process and thought process. Next slide. one of the interesting things, every time you get on a focus group with employees, they share their own best practices. I mean, everybody has, learned what works for them. And, what we're finding too is that we're having sort of communities of practice that are allowing people to share those in a SharePoint site or what have you, of tips and tricks of how to make this hybrid work environment and establishing and keeping healthy boundaries work. And so, a lot of these things are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, a lot of people use the online notifications out of the office, busy and offline, and adhere to them. People have at the bottom of their email, their availability, when they work, what their work hours are. So there's no doubt in anyone's mind. People are using their commute time for social interaction. Those kinds of things, scheduling and taking breaks. And we've got a lot of people that are sharing really interesting things about, virtual coffee breaks, so that you take time in every meeting that you have to connect on a personal level with people before you get into the specifics of the meeting itself. So there's that. Some people have decided to change geographies, to move to a different geography where they're closer to family and friends. But when you're working from anywhere, it lends itself to that. And that has been a huge uplift for a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people talk about using some of these mindfulness apps like Calm and Headspace and sharing, how to use those into their maximum potential with their colleagues. Minimizing simple distractions is another thing that I hear a lot about, is separating yourself from, things that will distract you from being productive, staying away from the television, staying away from, where the refrigerator is, or where the video games are, and so forth, to be able to have that dedicated space and not get distracted so you can be productive and have that work-life balance. So these are some of the things that we're seeing being shared across industries and in sort of communities of practice with other colleagues. They're kind of hacks for how to make healthy boundaries work for you. Thanks. Appreciate it.
There we go. Had to find the unmute button. Sorry about that.
I know.
Wow. I want to thank Dr. Moore and Verna for sharing your insights, your information, but most importantly, your personal stories. That was really special. Love the tips to self-regulate. I saw a lot of comments about it's okay to talk to yourself and how we're all relieved by that. So that was nice. Verna, you even mentioned that those conversations with yourself. That was good to know. What really jumped out at me in some of the comments was that tension between balancing individual autonomy and flexibility, balancing that with expectations on how we operate and build community. So a lot of good stuff came out there. At the end, hearing about the isolation and the importance of connection and engagement, and love the tips with how employees are sharing with each other. So lots of great content. This deck will be shared out, a link to the deck to all the participants. So all that great information, you'll get that. So now we are at the point, we got 15 minutes left in our session. This is where we leverage the collective wisdom from the HR leadership group. We'd like to hear from you. So what we're gonna do is, Tim, if you could go to the next slide, please. We're gonna do a couple poll questions, and we've got 3 lined up. We're going to move through them quickly. We want to hear from you on a couple quick questions. So we'll get that feedback. You'll kind of see where people are, and then we're going to turn on the live Q&A session. I already see that there are a number of questions being teed up in our Slido app, and we have the ability to upvote them. So it's really cool. I'll be able to see what people are most interested in, and we'll spend the rest of our time together. With Q&A with Fern and Dr. Moore. So here we go. Here's our first poll question. use your Slido app. Again, if you didn't catch it the first time, there's the website and the barcode. So we heard from Dr. Moore and Verna the importance of setting and reinforcing healthy boundaries in a hybrid workplace. Things like setting times to sign off and sign on to work, dressing for the workplace, remembering workplace policies such as professionalism. So here we go. I see a number of people are already responding. The question is, have you established any of these expectations around what's okay and what's not? And we can see that most are a work in progress. Some have already established those expectations. I'd love to hear from some of you. And others are thinking about it. But there's a few that are still at the point where, what are we talking about boundaries? Complete honesty there. So that's good to see that this is on the forefront of people's minds, and figuring out what those boundaries are for what's okay and what's not is in progress. Let's go into the next poll question, because I do want to get to the Q&A. So we have another one for you. We heard that setting clear boundaries helps reduce that constant pressure of always being on. Now, that can be a cultural norm, right? If you came from the past where that was expected, how do we shift that? Because it's not good for us. So here we go. It's not a big shift to the culture, but there's work to do. But 31% are saying we need to evolve our culture. That really jumped out at me as that 24/7. That's what we've grown up with. What might need to change there. So there's some that still have a long way to go, but others that are there have already maybe shifted the culture, or addressed that. But the majority, again, is it's a work in progress. Still have more work to do. And here comes the second question, that acknowledgement that there's some work that needs to be done. All right, one more poll question, and then we're going to jump into live Q&A. So we heard that autonomy and community are both important. Dr. Moore mentioned the importance of looking for ways to create that community, maybe pre and post meeting. So the question is, within your organization, have you found any creative ways to create community with a hybrid workplace? So this isn't a yes or no. This is a question about what you might have done. So let's see what's coming out. Coffee Talk Tuesdays. That there was a question in the Q&A I already saw too, as you're entering your comments, that need to reinforce engagement and connectiveness. How do you do that long-term, short-term and long-term? There's going to be some great discussion there. Overcoming that fear of losing connection, fear of not being seen, not available, not working. How do you overcome that? So we've got dedicated huddle times. Interesting. Rather than on the fly, setting aside time for that. Lunch meetings at each other's homes. I love that idea. Branded swag. Some aren't there yet, having a still poorly creating community. Check-ins and check-outs. Hearing from leaders in town halls, virtual walkthroughs through the World Walking app. Haven't used that before. Interesting comments. Early on, we did a better job, but haven't maintained it. Gets back to that. How do you sustain that long term? And in some cases, companies can't do a hybrid workplace. And apparently, Bob has some pretty good virtual happy hours that help us connect. This is great stuff. Okay. All right. So for the sake of time, let's move into our live Q&A. Again, use the Slido application to enter any questions that you'd like our speakers to address. And one of the features of this tool is you can upvote questions. So if you see a question out there that you'd like answered, please click on the thumbs up, and the most popular questions will raise to the top. And thank you, Stephanie, for reminding me to remind everyone else there is a survey that'll be in the chat. If you could take a few minutes to provide some feedback on today's session, either during our session before you leave or afterwards with the link that's provided. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Keep entering your questions and upvoting the ones you'd like to hear from. And let's talk about the first question. I'm going to open the floor up to Verna and Dr. Moore. You could turn your cameras on. Oops, there we go. And let's answer the question, your best suggestions for someone working from home with no extra four walls for an office. Very practical. I don't have an office. My office is taken over my dining room table. Verna or Dr. Moore, do you have any suggestions for someone that doesn't have that dedicated office space?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I actually had a situation like this with a client I was working with. She was same way. She had kids all over the place. She had no office space. She was in the middle of the kitchen table. So what we decided was setting some time and limits for the rest of her family when they could and could not come into that space. And so she put up a little piece of tape right over the door. And when she put that piece of tape up, her kids knew they could not come over the tape. They could not come in that space. And that was her working space. So what we first did was we made a physical, okay, the piece of tape. But then she also had a conversation and explained to them, this is how mom is working now. This is my space. In order for me to be able to do this, then I need for you to be able to respect this boundary. But what she also did was she made sure when she wasn't working, we talked about coming out of that space and say, okay, I'm on break now. We can talk, we can have conversations. And what it began to do is the kids and the rest of the family began to know this is the space, this is the quiet space, this is the time here, this is the boundary. And really, kids really are better at adjusting to change than we are as adults. If you give them some set established rules and you show them, and then you also keep to the rules, then they'll do a great job with adjusting as well. And that's what she found within creating that space.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Verna, anything that you would add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of those points. I think also, it gets to the conversation we had earlier around whether people have, not everybody lives in a single family home, et cetera. I think being able to segregate your space and several people have shared with me that they put up privacy screens in a corner. They've outfitted a closet, that has a pull down desk, etc. So there are some hacks that you can do to set up a segregated space that this is for work and the rest is for home. I think there's a lot of good best practices around, how to set up that physical space. But how do you, segregate those distractions that, can happen in your workspace? I think Dr. Moore hit it right on the head around, making sure that there's rules of engagement in your home for when is work time and when is not. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's tackle another popular question. How do you know if an employee is having trouble with boundaries? And that could be interpreted as establishing boundaries or adhering to boundaries.
Yeah.
Dr. Moore and Verna, what do you think?
Yeah, I can go on that one first. What we see is, people constantly having overtime or large amounts of hours on a consistent basis. We see a lot of people showing up late for meetings, disengaging, turning off their their cameras, and sort of retreating a little bit. We see people opting out of things that are optional that they would necessarily have done if they were on site in the previous life. So, there's sort of some telltale signs that people are struggling with, managing all the things in their life by tardiness, not showing up, being disengaged, not participating at the level that they used to participate in meetings and discussions. Those kinds of things are good indicators.
So something's changed where they used to be engaged, right, and you've noticed a change. Yeah. Thank you. How about you, Dr. Moore? Any other signs that you watch for or you see that indicate someone's struggling with setting boundaries or adhering to them?
Yeah, I agree with everything Verna said, and I would just echo. Many of us know our employees' standard way of practicing. And if that's changed, if you see that they're not as engaged, if you see that they're late, it's just like if they were in the office. If they started having attendance issues, you want to address them right then and there. And so it gives you a real clue of what has changed in the way that they're presenting or showing up for work. And but the big piece about this I want to say is, as employers, we have the responsibility to define the boundaries.
Yeah.
So we need to define the boundaries, then we can measure how they're doing within those boundaries. And what happened was we all got thrown into this. And so now we're doing it. And we haven't really sat down and said, okay, let's stop now. And hopefully after this, all of us will stop and say, okay, these are the boundaries within the workplace. This is the expectations of a hybrid work setting that we're expecting. And this is how you'll be measured, which will really help some of the anxiety with some of the employees, because they'll have a measurement tool that says, okay, this is how they're going to measure me. And is my camera on? Am I there on time? Is my hair combed? Do I have on a proper shirt? Just some of the basics. So just being able to measure them in that way, but giving them that list of this is how we're going to measure you.
Yeah,
Very good.
And I would also say that, you know, most companies that have a hybrid work environment, you know, everyone has an employee handbook, but there is a dedicated space in that handbook for their hybrid workplace policy that has those expectations around workplace norms.
Very good. Very good. I want to get to this other question. It seems in line with what we just mentioned. How have others balanced being flexible, but yet establishing clear expectations on how the organization operates and communicates? So that balance between individual autonomy and flexibility balanced with how the company needs to operate, right? Because it seems like there's got to be a balance between what, Dr. Moore, you just mentioned, what boundaries are kind of acceptable norms. How have you seen companies deal with that balancing individuality and what the company needs from its employees to operate effectively? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I can start with that one. So I've seen some companies have really stretched that marker of, okay, this is what we're going to allow. However, they have a clear message of, but this is the work we have to get done. And so many companies have said, okay, yeah, you might be able to do it at 5 o'clock where you used to do it at 10 a.m., but it still needs to get done. And so I have seen companies do that, especially when employees had children at home that they had to help with schooling and making sure they're online. And so I've seen companies make that flexibility there, but still establishing, but we still got to get the work done. And there are some non-negotiables. And so what are those non-negotiables? Those non-negotiables are, if we have all staff meeting, you've got to work it out and you've got to be there. If something's mandatory, you need to be there. If there's a deadline or a timeline for something, you've got to meet that deadline and timeline. And then we're also going to give you time to be able to be flexible for those things that you have to do at home, as long as these non-negotiables are taken care of. And that was different for a lot of us to have to do, but we found that we had to do it just because it was the nature of the setting for many people that were working from home and working in a hybrid model.
Yeah,
very good.
I would just add two things real quickly. I think flexibility, what we're seeing is that it's role-based, and that every employee in a hybrid work environment is designated as hybrid, on-site, or remote, fully remote, and therefore there are flexibility guidelines for each of those workplace designations. So it's flexibility that's role-based, and also how you define productivity. Is it hours logged or is it results and outcomes? And so there's a lot of attention being given to, I don't care how many hours you charge or when you work, as long as you achieve the deadlines and the results and the outcomes that we're focused on.
Very good. I am sad to say that we are at the end of our session. I feel like we could go on with Q&A for another hour. A lot of good questions here, and Verna and Dr. Moore, fabulous, sharing with us your insights. But this does bring us to the end of our session for today. thank you again to our speakers. Again, a reminder to please complete the feedback survey for our participants. You'll be getting a link to this presentation with all this great material. And in closing, I hope to see all of you at the December 16th virtual town hall happy hour with Bob's Fabulous Drinks. So with that, thank you again. I hope everybody has a great day and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Great day.
Thank you. Great job. Great job.